The sun was setting low over the frontier, spilling molten gold across the rolling meadows and the winding river that cut through them like a silver ribbon. The wilderness was quiet except for the cry of a hawk circling above, its wings stretched wide as if it owned the fading sky. Down by the water's edge, a young woman knelt beside a worn leather satchel, her fingers trembling as she tried to wash away the dust of travel from her face. Her name was Clara Winslow, and she'd been riding for 3 days straight, escaping a life that no longer felt like hers. Her dress, once a soft blue, was now streaked with the ochre of the open plains. Her boots were scuffed, her hair loose and tangled from the wind, but in her eyes, those storm-gray eyes, there was a fierce spark that not even exhaustion could dim. She had come west chasing freedom, though she wasn't sure she even knew what that meant anymore. All she knew was that behind her lay the town of Dry Creek, the unwanted proposal of a man twice her age, and the weight of expectations that had smothered her since birth. As the water lapped gently at her hands, Clara felt the land around her breathing, wild, untamed, and full of secrets. She'd never been this far into the frontier before. The mountains in the distance looked like sleeping giants, their snowy crowns glowing pink under the sinking sun. The air smelled of pine and sage and something deeper, something like destiny. She had heard stories in town about this place, of lone trappers, of wolves that sang to the moon, and of men who rode with the wind instead of against it. But stories, she thought, were for those who stayed safe behind their walls. She was not one of them anymore. When a twig snapped behind her, Clara spun around, heart thudding in her chest. Her hand flew instinctively to the small pistol hidden under her satchel. From between the trees stepped a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his shadow long against the riverbank. He was dressed in trail-worn leather, a rifle slung loosely over his back and a hat that shaded most of his face. Yet even in the dim light, Clara could see the hint of a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "Don't shoot, miss," he said, his voice low and steady like gravel and honey mixed together. "I reckon you'd hit me square in the heart, and that'd be a shame, 'cause that's where I keep my better intentions." His tone was teasing but not unkind. Clara hesitated, then lowered her weapon just an inch. She wasn't used to men who spoke with warmth instead of demand. "You startled me," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You're not from Dry Creek, are you?" He shook his head. "No, ma'am. I'm from wherever the wind decides to stop blowing. Name's Rowan Hayes." He tipped his hat slightly, and the fading light revealed eyes the color of amber whiskey, calm, alert, and quietly amused. Rowan approached slowly, careful not to make her flinch. He was the kind of man the frontier made and tested, sunburned skin, calloused hands, and a silence that spoke louder than words. When he reached the edge of the river, he crouched down, dipped his hand in the cold water, and splashed his face. "You're a long way from any settlement," he said. "You lost?" Clara met his gaze and shook her head. "Not lost, just looking for somewhere I can breathe." He studied her for a moment as though weighing her words. Then he nodded. "Fair enough. Out here, the air's pure, but it's got teeth. You'll need to know how to keep it from biting." She gave a small, uncertain smile. "And I suppose you're offering lessons?" "Maybe," he said, glancing at her satchel. "If you've got the grit to learn." As twilight deepened, Clara found herself oddly at ease in his presence. There was something about the man, something steady, protective, yet distant, like he belonged more to the land than to any person. He gathered firewood while she unpacked a small loaf of bread and some dried meat from her satchel. They shared their modest meal by the fire he built, flames flickering like dancing spirits between them. "Why are you really out here?" he asked after a while. Clara hesitated, staring into the fire. "Because I was tired of living someone else's life," she said finally. "My father wanted me to marry a man with money." "I wanted to see what it felt like to choose something for myself." Rowan nodded, the firelight carving shadows along his jaw. "You did right," he said simply. "Out here, a person learns what they're made of. The land don't lie." He leaned back against a fallen log, his eyes reflecting the flames. "You'll be safe here tonight. I'll take first watch." Clara looked at him, this stranger who seemed carved from stone and sunlight, and something inside her stirred, something she didn't have a name for. She felt the wind shift, cool and tender, brushing against her face like a whisper. She had been running from fear, from expectation, from loneliness. But for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid. She was simply alive, As she lay down near the fire, wrapped in her shawl, she watched Rowan sitting by the flames, the rifle resting across his knees, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the light. The wilderness hummed softly around them, alive with unseen life, and though they hadn't spoken much, Clara felt a strange connection, a thread of quiet understanding that tied her to the man she barely knew. She closed her eyes, and the last thing she heard before sleep claimed her was the deep, steady rhythm of his breathing, mingling with the sigh of the night wind. When dawn broke, it came softly, spilling pale light over the sleeping land like a blessing. The fire had long burned down to embers, and Clara woke to the faint scent of wood smoke and pine needles. The sky above was brushed in watercolor shades of rose and gold, and mist drifted lazily off the river. For a long moment she simply lay there, letting the sounds of the wild morning wash over her, the soft rustle of trees, the chirp of distant birds, and the low rumble of Rowan's voice as he spoke to his horse nearby. He was already awake, already moving, as if the world itself turned to his rhythm. Clara watched him from where she lay, the way the early light caught in his hair, the sure strength of his hands as he saddled the animal. He moved with quiet precision, every gesture purposeful yet unhurried. He didn't belong to any town or rule. He belonged to the frontier, and somehow, that thought filled her with both admiration and unease. When he noticed she was awake, Rowan smiled, a small fleeting curve of his lips that somehow felt like sunrise itself. "Mornin', Miss Winslow," he said. "You sleep all right?" She nodded, rising slowly, brushing twigs from her dress. "Better than I have in a long time," she admitted, surprising herself with the honesty of it. He poured her a tin cup of coffee, strong and black, and she accepted it gratefully. "I figured we'd head toward the ridge today," he said. "There's a trail that'll take us through the pines and into safer ground. Less chance of crossing anyone who'd rather see us dead than friendly." Clara frowned. "Anyone?" He shrugged, glancing toward the open plains. "Trappers, drifters, men who live by taking instead of working. Out here, not everyone plays fair." His words sent a shiver through her, but his calm tone, like slow thunder, kept her steady. They packed quickly. Clara tied her few belongings while Rowan checked his rifle and tightened the saddle straps. When she climbed onto the horse behind him, her heart hammered unexpectedly. She had ridden before, but never pressed so close to another person. Never with her hands uncertainly resting at a man's sides, feeling the rise and fall of his breath beneath her palms. She hesitated, and he looked back at her over his shoulder with a faint grin. "Go on, darling. You can hold on tighter than that. Wouldn't want you slipping off before breakfast." Her cheeks burned, but she obeyed, her arms encircling his waist. The leather of his vest was warm from the sun, and beneath it his body felt solid, grounded as though he were part of the land itself. The horse started forward, hooves clopping softly over dirt and stone, and with every sway of movement, Clara felt herself drawn deeper into the quiet rhythm of his world. As they rode through the forest trail, the air grew cooler, scented with pine sap and wildflowers. Shafts of sunlight broke through the canopy, gilding everything they touched. Rowan spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight. He pointed out signs in the landscape, the faint tracks of deer near the creek, the way a broken branch told of passing elk, the clusters of berries safe to eat. Clara listened with fascination. "How do you know all this?" she asked. He gave a soft laugh. "You learn when the land's the only thing standing between you and an empty belly." There was no arrogance in his tone, only truth. He was a man who had lived by his senses, who read the world like a language, and as he spoke, she began to realize how small her old life had been compared to this vast breathing wilderness. They stopped near midday to rest beside a meadow, alive with tall grass and purple lupine. Rowan dismounted first, then turned and offered his hand to help her down. She hesitated only a second before taking it. His palm was rough, but his touch was gentle, steadying her as she stepped to the ground. For a moment, neither of them moved. Their eyes met, and the air between them seemed to thicken, warm and alive. "You're learning fast," he said softly. "Most folks out here would have turned back by now." Clara smiled faintly. "Maybe I'm not most folks." He tilted his head, studying her. "No," he murmured. "You surely ain't." The way he said it made her heartbeat stumble, as if the words carried something unspoken beneath them. She turned away quickly, pretending to busy herself with the canteen, but she could feel his gaze linger a moment longer before he looked back to the horizon. They ate quietly, hard biscuits, a strip of jerky, a few berries Rowan had picked earlier. It wasn't much, but it felt like a feast after the long ride. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind that held space, like two souls learning each other's rhythms. When a breeze swept across the meadow, lifting strands of Clara's hair, Rowan reached out without thinking and brushed one from her cheek. His hand lingered a heartbeat too long. "You've got the look of someone meant for the wild," he said. The city folks wouldn't see it, but the land would. She swallowed, her voice catching in her throat. "And what does the land see?" His smile softened. "Strength, and maybe a heart that's braver than it knows." They rode again until the sun tilted westward. The mountains loomed closer now, their slopes carved by light and shadow. By the time they made camp near a cluster of aspen trees, Clara's muscles ached, but her spirit felt strangely light. Rowan set about building another fire, his movements sure and practiced. She gathered kindling and water, and when their hands brushed once, it sent a tremor through her chest. As the fire crackled to life, they sat beside it, the golden glow painting his face in soft relief. For a long time, they didn't speak. The wilderness filled the silence, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of wind through leaves. Finally, Clara said quietly, "I don't think I've ever felt this close to another person, or this free." Rowan's gaze met hers, steady and unreadable. Then, leaning slightly closer, his voice dropped low, rich with quiet promise. "You've never been this close to a man before?" he asked, his tone teasing but tender. Clara's breath hitched. "No," she whispered, heart trembling. His smile deepened, his words a whisper against the firelight. "You already are." And in that moment, under the great endless sky, the world seemed to hold its breath. There was no town, no past, no future, only two souls drawn together by the quiet pull of something older than words. The flames flickered between them, and the night wrapped around their laughter like a secret the land itself had chosen to keep. The next morning dawned gray, with a restless wind sweeping through the aspen grove. The songbirds were quiet. Even the river seemed to murmur with unease. Clara felt it in her chest, that strange tightening that told her something was coming. Rowan had risen before her, already scouting the ridge that overlooked their camp. When he returned, his face was set and serious, his jaw tight beneath the shadow of his hat. "We've got trouble brewing," he said. "Two riders on the horizon following our trail since sunrise. I can't say who they are yet, but I don't fancy their reason." Clara froze, fingers clutching the edge of her shawl. "Are they dangerous?" He gave a short nod. "Out here, anyone who follows without a word means to take what isn't theirs. Gold, horse, or worse." His tone stayed calm, but the warning in his eyes was sharp as a blade. He began packing swiftly, dousing the fire, tightening saddle straps. "We ride north," he said. Fast. They rode hard, the landscape blurring past, meadows, streams, and the vast reach of pine-covered hills. The wind stung Clara's cheeks, tore at her hair, but she didn't complain. Fear pounded in her chest, but beneath it was something steadier, a strange kind of trust. Every time Rowan turned his head to check the horizon, every command he gave, every instinct that guided them deeper into the wild, it made her feel protected, seen, alive. By midday, dark clouds gathered over the mountains, heavy with the promise of rain. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and thunder grumbled like an old beast waking from sleep. Rowan glanced skyward. "Storm's comin'. We'll shelter in the canyons ahead." As they neared the rocky cliffs, the first drops of rain began to fall. Fat, cold, relentless. The trail turned treacherous, the soil turning slick under the hooves of Rowan's horse. He guided it with expert precision, voice low and steady, never once showing fear. When lightning cracked overhead, Clara flinched, clinging to him tighter. He felt her shiver and murmured, "Hold on, darlin'. Ain't no storm made that can take us down." His voice, even in the chaos, carried warmth and certainty. By the time they reached the shelter of the canyon walls, they were soaked to the bone. Rowan helped her down, shielding her with his coat as the rain hammered the world around them. "We'll wait it out here," he said, ushering her into a shallow cave carved by years of wind and water. "You'll be warm soon." Inside, the cave smelled of stone and damp earth. Rowan gathered brushwood from a dry patch and struck a spark with practiced hands. Soon a fire flickered between them again, small but fierce, casting golden light over the rough walls. Clara sat close, wrapping her arms around her knees, her hair clinging in dark curls against her face. Rowan removed his soaked hat, setting it aside, and glanced at her. "You all right?" She nodded, though her voice trembled. I didn't think the frontier would be this wild. He gave a quiet chuckle. The land's wild, sure, but it's honest. Storms come and go, but they don't pretend to be something they're not. His words lingered in the air, soft and true. She met his gaze, and for the first time, she saw beyond his strength, into the gentleness that lived beneath it. The kind that only those who'd survived loneliness could carry. Outside, the storm raged, lightning splitting the sky in brilliant flashes. Inside, the world felt small and warm. The fire painted his face in bronze light, and Clara found herself studying every detail. The scar on his jaw, the crease at the corner of his eyes when he smiled faintly. "Rowan," she said softly, "why do you live out here all alone?" He hesitated before answering, eyes on the fire. "Because once I tried living in a town, tried being a man folks wanted me to be, but I found more truth in one sunrise out here than in a year behind walls." He turned to her. "What about you, Clara? What are you running from?" She looked down, fingers tracing circles on her skirt. "A life that didn't belong to me. Expectations, promises I never made. I thought coming west would make me free, but maybe I just traded one kind of loneliness for another." He reached across the small space between them, taking her hand gently. "Freedom's heavy sometimes," he said. "It'll break you if you don't share the weight." His thumb brushed lightly over her knuckles, rough but tender. She felt her heart stutter. "And who would share it with me?" she whispered. His answer came low and sure. "Someone who's already carrying the same kind." The words wrapped around her like the warmth of the fire. For a long moment they sat in silence, the storm raging outside while something softer, deeper, grew between them, something that had nothing to do with fear or survival, and everything to do with belonging. Then a distant sound broke the spell, the echo of hooves against wet stone. Rowan stiffened instantly, his hand going to his rifle. "They found us," he muttered. "The riders." Clara's breath caught as he rose, every muscle in his body coiled and ready. "Stay here," he said quietly. "No matter what you hear, don't move." But before she could answer, lightning lit the canyon mouth, and two figures appeared in silhouette, men on horseback, faces half covered by rain-soaked scarves. "Looks like the trail led us right," one called out, voice hard. "What's a man like you doing hiding with a lady that fine?" Rowan stepped forward, rifle steady but his tone calm. "You boys best ride on. Ain't nothing here worth your trouble." The other man laughed, cruel and sharp. "That's where you're wrong." The next seconds were chaos. A shot cracked through the rain, echoing like thunder. Clara screamed, dropping to the ground as the fire flared from the blast. Rowan fired back once, twice, moving with the fierce grace of instinct. The echo of gunfire rolled through the canyon, then silence. When it ended, only the storm spoke again. Clara lifted her head, trembling, to see Rowan standing over one of the men, the other having fled into the rain. His chest rose and fell heavily, the rifle smoking in his hands. When he turned back toward her, she saw the crimson stain spreading down his arm. "Rowan!" She rushed to him, catching his sleeve. "You're hurt." He smiled faintly, shaking his head. "Just grazed, darlin'. Takes more than a storm and a fool with a gun to bring me down." Her hands pressed against the wound, her touch trembling. "You shouldn't have done that for me," she whispered. His eyes softened, voice low and unyielding. "Wasn't for you," he said. "It was because I couldn't stand the thought of this land losing someone like you." She blinked back tears, her throat tightening. "You barely know me." He leaned in, close enough that she could feel his breath warm against her cheek. "Maybe, but sometimes the heart don't wait for the world to make sense." Outside, the storm began to fade. The thunder rolled away into the distance, leaving only the hush of falling rain. Inside the cave, the fire burned low, and Rowan's hand found hers again. They sat like that until dawn. Two souls stitched together by danger, by silence, and by something new and fragile that neither dared to name. By morning, the rain had washed the world clean. The canyon shimmered beneath the sun, each stone glistening with beads of water, each leaf heavy with light. Smoke rose from the dying fire inside the cave, curling lazily toward the mouth of dawn. Rowan sat by the embers, his injured arm wrapped in a strip of linen torn from Clara's shawl. She had insisted on binding it herself, her fingers trembling as she worked, her face pale with worry. Now she knelt beside him, rinsing the blood from her hands in a small pool of rainwater. He watched her quietly, the way her hair caught the morning glow, the determined curve of her jaw. She was no longer the frightened girl he'd found by the river. There was a steadiness in her now, like the land itself had chosen to lend her some of its strength. "You should rest," he said softly. His voice carried that warm, rough timbre that always seemed to settle her nerves. She shook her head. "You should," she countered gently. "You were shot." His lips curved faintly. "I've had worse. Once got myself gored by a bull elk up near the Rockies. Lived on pine tea and luck for a week." Clara looked at him, half in disbelief, half in admiration. "You say that like it's nothing," he shrugged, eyes glinting with quiet amusement. "Out here it usually is." The air still smelled of rain, and somewhere high above, a hawk circled lazily against the blue. Rowan winced as he moved his arm, and Clara reached out instinctively to steady him. Her hand lingered on his sleeve, their eyes meeting. "You saved me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You could have ridden off and let them take what they wanted, but you didn't." His gaze softened, golden and steady. "Ain't in my nature to leave someone standing alone in a storm," he said. "Besides," he hesitated, then added quietly, "you remind me of someone I once knew. Someone who believed in things I thought the world had buried." Clara tilted her head. "Who?" Rowan looked toward the canyon mouth where sunlight poured through like spilled honey. "My mother," he said after a pause. She had the same fire, the same stubborn streak that made her stand taller than any man in a room full of them. She used to say the land only bends for those who respect it. Clara smiled faintly. "Sounds like she raised you right." He gave a low chuckle. "She tried. I just had to wander off and learn it the hard way." The day passed slowly, the kind of quiet that only follows chaos. They built a new fire and cooked what little food remained. Clara gathered herbs she recognized from her father's books, wild mint, sage, yarrow, and brewed a simple tea to ease his pain. As the hours slipped by, they talked, not as strangers anymore, but as two people who had found a rare and fragile understanding. Rowan told her of the years he'd spent trapping near the northern ridges, of nights so cold he thought the stars themselves would shatter. Clara told him of the library her mother had left her, of the poetry she used to whisper beneath candlelight when the world outside her window felt too small. Their stories wove together like threads of a shared past, and somewhere in that weaving, they found something unspoken, something that felt dangerously close to home. When the sun dipped low again, painting the sky in orange and violet, they moved their camp to a higher ledge overlooking the valley. From there, the world stretched endlessly, a sea of trees rolling toward the horizon, a river flashing like silver in the distance. "It's beautiful," Clara breathed, awe in her voice. Rowan nodded. "That's why I stay," he said. "Every sunrise feels like a promise that ain't been broken yet." She turned toward him. "Do you ever get lonely?" He was silent a long time before answering. "Sometimes. But then I remind myself that loneliness just means you're waiting for someone who understands the quiet." She looked at him then, not as the man who had saved her, but as the man who had been waiting for someone without even knowing it. He caught her gaze and smiled, slow and genuine. "You look like you've got something on your mind," he said. Clara hesitated. "I was just thinking how strange it is," she murmured. "Two people from different worlds ending up in the same place at the same time." Rowan's voice dropped low, soft as wind over grass. "Maybe it ain't strange at all. Maybe the land just knew we both needed somewhere to stop running." As night fell, the stars came alive one by one, scattered across the vast black sky like embers from some celestial fire. They lay near the campfire, wrapped in the warmth of shared silence. The sounds of the wilderness became their lullaby, the whisper of wind through sage, the distant call of a coyote, the low crackle of burning wood. Clara shifted closer to him, her shoulder brushing his arm. "Rowan," she said quietly, "do you ever think about what comes after all this?" He turned his head slightly. "After?" "After the storms, after the running. What then?" He thought for a long moment before answering. "I used to think there was no after. Just one more ridge to cross, one more winter to outlast. But now," he looked at her, his voice softening, "now I reckon there's something worth staying for." The words hung between them, fragile and certain. Clara's breath caught, her heart hammering. "And what would that be?" she asked, though she already knew. Rowan smiled, the firelight catching in his eyes. "You." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full. Full of all the things they hadn't said. all the fears and hopes and quiet confessions that lived between one heartbeat and the next. Clara felt tears sting her eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming truth of it. She reached out, her hand finding his. His fingers curled gently around hers, strong and warm. They stayed like that, their joined hands glowing in the firelight. Two wanderers who had finally found something worth belonging to. When the wind rose again, carrying the scent of pine and rain and earth, Clara rested her head against his shoulder. Rowan exhaled slowly, his arm coming around her, careful and sure. They didn't speak again that night. They didn't need to. The stars said enough. The land said enough. And somewhere deep inside, Clara realized that freedom wasn't the absence of walls. It was the moment you found someone who made the world wide open just by standing beside you. The following days were bright and full of quiet work. Rowan's wound healed slowly under Clara's careful tending, and together they moved through the land like they belonged to it. The air grew warmer, the storms gentler, the world ripening into a new season. Clara learned to start a fire with flint, to read the sky for rain, and to ride with balance that made Rowan grin with pride. Each evening, as they set camp beneath the stars, their laughter blended with the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind through the grass. It wasn't the life she'd imagined, but maybe that was the point. Freedom, she realized, was not running away. It was finding the courage to stay where your heart finally felt at rest. One morning, as dawn spilled like liquid gold across the valley, Rowan saddled his horse and stood looking toward the distant ridge. "We're coming up on Blackwater Pass," he said. "On the other side lies the mining towns, places with people, work, roofs that don't leak when it rains." He glanced back at her. "You could start over there, Clara. No one would know your name." She studied him for a long time. "And what about you?" He gave a half smile. "Me? I've never been much for towns. I'll keep to the high country a while." His words were calm, but beneath them she heard the quiet ache, like a door closing that neither of them wanted shut. They rode toward the pass in silence, the trail winding through wildflowers and stones still wet with dew. Each step forward felt heavier. Clara thought of everything they'd been through, the river, the storm, the danger, the laughter that had followed. The thought of leaving it behind felt like tearing pages from her own heart. "Rowan," she said finally, "when I left Dry Creek, I thought I wanted to be alone. But I was wrong. I wasn't running from people, I was running from myself." He slowed the horse, turning to look at her, his amber eyes steady. "And did you find what you were looking for?" She nodded, tears bright in her eyes. "Yes, I found someone who made me stop running." For a moment, neither spoke. The wind carried the scent of pine and dust and distant rain. Then Rowan sighed deep and low. "Clara and I ain't got much to offer. No house, no land, no promise of comfort. Just the trail, the sky, and a heart that don't know how to quit once it's been given." His voice cracked slightly on the last words, roughened by something more than wind. She smiled through her tears. "Then that's more than any man back in Dry Creek ever had." They reached the top of the ridge by midday. The land stretched wide below them, rolling green meadows giving way to endless blue horizon. The river they had followed glimmered far beneath like a silver thread stitching earth to sky. Clara dismounted, walking to the edge, her skirts whipping in the wind. She turned to face him, her hair catching sunlight like strands of gold. "This is where the river meets the sky," she said softly. "It feels like the edge of the world." Rowan joined her, his presence a steady warmth at her side. "It ain't the edge," he said. "It's the start of something new." They stood there for a long time, neither willing to break the spell. Then Clara turned toward him fully, her voice trembling with truth. "If I go to the towns, I'll have safety, but I'll lose the part of me I found out here with you. I don't want a life behind walls anymore. I want this. I want the wind, the stars, the river. And you." Rowan looked at her as though seeing the sunrise for the first time. His jaw tightened, his breath caught, and then he reached for her hand, his rough fingers curling gently around hers. "You sure, darling? The frontier don't promise peace. Just a fight worth fighting." Clara's eyes glistened, her smile small and sure. "Then I'll fight it with you." For a heartbeat, the world seemed to still. Then he drew her closer, slow and reverent, his forehead resting against hers. The wind swirled around them, carrying the scent of wild sage and promise. "You've never been this close to a man before," he whispered, echoing that night by the fire. Her voice was soft but certain when she answered, "No, Rowan, but I've never been this close to home either." He smiled. that quiet, rare smile that had first disarmed her by the river, and then he kissed her, gentle at first like the meeting of two breaths, then deeper like the earth itself had tilted to bless the moment. It wasn't the desperate kind of love born from fear. It was steady, sure, born from every sunrise they'd shared and every storm they'd survived. When they finally parted, she rested her head against his chest, listening to the strong, steady rhythm of his heart, the sound that now felt like the heartbeat of the land around them. They made their home not far from that ridge, in a small clearing where the river curved gently through the pines. Together they built a cabin from logs and patience, its walls smelling of fresh cedar and smoke. The days were hard but good, filled with laughter, work, and a peace that grew stronger with every season. Clara learned to plant and harvest, to read the sky for weather. Rowan learned the comfort of words spoken softly at dusk. Some nights when the fire burned low, she would sit beside him and read from her mother's old poetry book, her voice blending with the crackle of flames. And when he looked at her, his eyes still carried that same wonder, as though he could hardly believe she'd chosen to stay. Years later, travelers passing through the valley sometimes spoke of a small homestead where a woman with gray-flecked hair and bright eyes offered bread and stories by the fire. They said her husband was a quiet man who spoke little but smiled often, and that the two of them seemed as much a part of the land as the river or the trees. And if you listened close when the wind moved through the canyons at dusk, you might hear their laughter carried on the air, soft, content, eternal. For in that place where the river met the sky, two souls had found what so many had chased and lost along the way, not just love, but belonging. And in the hush of each sunset, when the land turned gold and the air shimmered with memory, Rowan would sometimes turn to her, brush a strand of hair from her face, and whisper the same words that had begun it all. "Careful, darling. That's where you live now."